Good afternoon. I'm Anthony van der Hoek. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series called Frankly Speaking, hosted by BDO Business Services and Advisory. Today's theme is the virtual or long distance business leader, which is very appropriate for the times we face as lockdown eases and we acclimatize to what is becoming known as the new normal. To share his insights with us is Greg Castle. For those of you who don't know Greg, he's an internationally certified professional business and executive coach with more than 26 years experience as an entrepreneur, business owner, corporate company director, with a track record of successful business growth and strategic change management, employing strong market orientation across numerous industries. Greg is also the founder of a strategic marketing consultancy called Talkle, and is a business partner of coaching company Action Coach. So the format of today's webinar is that Greg will share his insights, which will take approximately 45 minutes, after which there will be time to take some questions. You are very welcome to post questions on the Q&A during the webinar, which will be answered at the end. There will also be a very short survey at the end, which I ask you to look out for. And we don't anticipate any technical problems, but should you experience persistent connection problems with the webinar, it may be necessary to log off and log on again. I now hand over to Greg.
Thanks, Anthony, and good afternoon to everybody. And thanks to Anthony for the intro and to BDO for the invitation to run this webinar series on various forms of general business aspects, really, that I have interacted with my own clients on a day-to-day basis. And hopefully you'll find this one in particular rather useful in that this is an issue that all of us are really grappling with at this point, something that's somewhat different. The fact that it's Wednesday today, I must just tell you though, is in Cape Town, for those that aren't from the Cape, is known as Klein Saterdag, which is Small Saturday, which means you can have the rest of the afternoon off after the webinar. So I just wanted to let you know that up front. But in all seriousness, the topic today is really something that is relevant, not just purely because of the fact that we've been going through this lockdown period, but it really is something that lends itself to opportunity for you and for your business going forward. And really, I honestly believe, and have for the last more than a decade, that we should be encouraging more of this flexibility in terms of work and work from home, so long as it's practical and it's professional. And there are two reasons for that right now. The one is, of course, that it's, there's less chance of unnecessary spreading of the virus, particularly to the most vulnerable people. So we're not thinking about necessarily the people in the office that are so much the issue, but what about the grandparents or, the slightly less healthy individuals who may get impacted in the home environment, and why, if it's unnecessary to do so. But more so, think about the savings that one can have in the long run. Think about your rental that you don't actually need to pay in order to have everybody with their bums on seats. Think about the furniture and so on that you can actually get rid of and sell and never have to buy again. Just think of little things like the coffee and tea bill and the milk and the cleaning bill, etc. So there are a lot of benefits to operating like this in the longer term. It's not really something that has to be forced. It really should be something encouraged, and hopefully during the course of today there'll be some insights that'll give you a couple of tips and clues, some of which you'll probably already have implemented, and others that may be blinding flashes of the obvious, and some that you may find really particularly worth considering for your own business going forward. So so with that, let's get cracking. So the starting point, I thought, if we move on to the next slide, I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention that we're doing this remotely, and just as a case in point, everybody that's involved in the webinar, and there are a whole lot of people behind the scenes, at BDO have all been encouraged to continue working from home until the advent of stage 1, which is a really mature and sensible thing to do where practical. Obviously, if one has to have people in a manufacturing environment or that sort of thing, it's a different story altogether. So just running through what I'm going to cover today, really just some ideas on how to lead differently. And this is all about leadership. So despite the fact that it's virtual, it really is about leadership. The 5 dysfunctions of a team, just to give you some insights into those: leading remotely, requiring influence of command. The fact that you can't do it all, talking a little bit about delegation and how to delegate and why to delegate. The use of technology, the servant leadership mindset, and ultimately keys to a winning team. So if we move on from that, perhaps just a little bit of background to myself and why this is such a relevant thing as far as my my own life is concerned. I really realized as a youngster that life can be short. I had a father that had a heart attack very early on in life, and but it took me a long time through a corporate career to realize a work-life balance. And in a way, there was an element of guilt around this whole feeling of whether or not one could actually have a balance in life. And I think it's got beyond that now. I think it's got to a point where people are starting to realize that there's far greater productivity that can come from a balanced life. And that comes from whether you're a business owner or whether you're somebody who works for the organization. The more balanced your life is, the more flexible it is, the greater the productivity can be, so long as the measures are in place. And we'll talk more about that. So, despite the fact that in my corporate career, in the early parts of my life, I was quite vocal about the fact that really, why do we need people to be queuing up in traffic for hours on end to get into a central, work environment that could waste possibly 2 hours, up to 2 hours of their time in the morning and 2 hours of their time in the afternoon, just to sit in traffic? I mean, just think of the productivity that one could use if, get value of if you just used half of that. So it's not just that, of course, it's the frustrations of having a work environment where you remote from your family. And let's say you're a single parent. You've got kids that are staying with you, a kid that may be sick, needs to stay at home. There's nobody to look after the kid at home. What do you do? So it becomes a stressed environment, and the stress is something that comes through in the work environment as well in various different forms. And that can manifest itself in things like, the grapevine, political, office politics, as well as just purely not having your head in the workspace. So a lot of my life has been really a personal shift in terms of getting a work-life balance, and also realizing how that doesn't mean that one has to be any less effective. In fact, it can be just the opposite. So if we move on to the next slide. So talking about virtual leadership, well, just to start with, sorry, the slide's obviously corrupted slightly, but it's really indicating the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And it really starts at the very bottom with an absence of trust. If you don't trust people that work for you, either you've got the wrong people working for you, or you haven't given them sufficient tools in order to do the job that you feel that they should be doing. And therefore you feel you have to do it yourself, typical entrepreneur type of attitude. Or quite frankly, you're the person with the problem. And I can tell you in terms of the dozens of people that I've been entrepreneurs and business owners that I've been mentoring and coaching over the years, one of the biggest issues is the fact that they honestly don't believe that anybody can do it quite as well as they can. So I'm going to talk a lot to that a little later on. But that often leads to also the fear of conflict, and there can be a fear of conflict in the work environment where people are afraid to disagree with one another or possibly with the owner or the boss, which can lead to a lack of commitment. You know, I'm just going to do the bare minimum because, quite frankly, otherwise I'll just get into trouble. There's an avoidance of accountability. And then ultimately, you know, if there's inattention to results, that creates a dysfunctional team. So we move on to the next slide with those aspects in mind. So there's a slightly delayed transition, so just bear with us a little bit. Sometimes it speeds up, sometimes it slows down. So the first rule of virtual leadership, I'm sort of talking about rules here, is that leadership comes first. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're based on some island remotely, or whether you're stuck in the bush, or whether you're working from home. Quite frankly, the whole aspect of leadership is the same. It's the nuances now that need to change and adapt, not leadership. There really are four common questions that typically come up that leaders would ask, and the one is, how do I know if people are really working, if they're not, if I don't see their bums on seats and I don't see them sitting in front of their computers or whatever it is that they do in your work environment? Are people getting enough social interaction? Is there enough of that team spirit that's unfolding as a result of people being together? And, are we getting sufficient feedback, particularly where there are other strategic options that one could be considering? There's that easy opportunity to just pop into somebody's office and just, say something, as opposed to necessarily dial them up or get onto Zoom and set up a meeting accordingly. And the other question is, can we be as effective and productive if we remote? So if we move onto the next slide. The second rule is that, leading remotely really requires you to purely adapt your leadership, but don't change your leadership completely. And the fact is, that this isn't something that's new. 80% of managers already have at least one report who works in a different location to themselves. I mean, if you think about sales managers, national sales managers who have reps all over the country, people who operate from offices internationally and have various different sites around the world, etc., or franchises, quite frankly, that operate independently. But there are, of course, consequences to leaders in working remotely. The one is the methods of communication that you've used in the past now need to be changed, need to be adapted. So communication is a critical part of how your leadership now needs to adapt. And the fact is that it's no longer the leader feeling simply emotionally remote from his team, because his or her team, purely because it's a leadership, the lonely role of being the leader of an organization sometimes. But now you are physically also remote, which adds to that. But of course, the act of leadership itself doesn't change. And that's a really important thing to reiterate. We just need to do things somewhat differently. If we could move on to the next slide. So the whole focus really is on how to create a winning team and how to keep that winning team no matter where they're working from. And there really are 9 different keys that I call them that contribute to a winning team. And these are all important whether you're remote or whether you aren't. The first is strong leadership. And you may have different styles. You may have a tough style of leadership. You may have a very easygoing style of leadership. And I'll talk more about leadership and how leadership needs to be adapted to particular individuals in order to get the most out of those individuals, within reason, of course. But the second point, which is absolutely critical, is, do you have the right people in your organization? And now the question may be a little bit different because people are remote. Do you have people with a sense of EQ and maturity that enables them to work remotely and to work effectively and to actually be productive without you having to feel that you have to micromanage people. If you have to micromanage your team, not just because you think you ought to, but because you have to, then quite frankly, you have the wrong team. And that's something that you need to consider now going forward as well. Sometimes it's an educational process of developing them accordingly to understand the new protocols and the standard operating procedures, etc. But more than ever, this is a time that you need to consider the kind of people that you want in your organization. And then, of course, it's absolutely critical that everybody understands what is that common goal that we're heading towards. And without that common goal, there's absolutely no point. Things can't move forward without everybody understanding what it is that the boss wants us to do. And when you're in an organization, generally small, medium-sized companies, very often there is just that assumption that people know where things are going. And that's really not the case at all. And then understanding the rules of the game. It's very important that those are set up front and that everybody is absolutely clear on what that is. And it's in a written form, so people know how to behave accordingly. What's the protocol when you're on a Zoom meeting? And then, of course, having an action plan. So it's all very well to have plans, but what is the action plan and who is responsible for what and by when? And then a big element, which I'll talk to more, is delegation and not abdication. Make sure that you're actually giving the right people who are appropriately ready and skilled and experienced, and with your coaching and development, the opportunity to take on more of the responsibility to free you up to be able to do other things. And I'll mention that in a bit more depth. And then support risk-taking. Give people the opportunity to make mistakes. If people fear making mistakes, they won't take, decisions. And that's just how life works. You can see it with your own kids at home, potentially. If there's the fear of doing something, they quite frankly will try and avoid doing it and going anywhere near it. And so, of course, within reason, support risk-taking, but calculated risk, and make sure that you balance that out with the fact that they don't make the same mistake twice. And then, of course, encouraging 100% involvement and inclusion. There is often this tendency to focus on one or two individuals purely because we have more of a chemistry and a rapport with them, or we just like their thinking, or whatever the case is. We've got to start to focus on more on 100% involvement. And through this process of virtual management, virtual leadership, it's something that really needs to be focused on, particularly in one-on-one sessions, and even if you're having a group meeting together where there is individual attention paid to each individual in one form or another. And then finally, of course, motivation and development. And that needs to, more than ever before, needs to be encouraged in the virtual workplace. Because now people, quite frankly, are, it's not easy to just walk down the passage and make a comment. So let's move on to the next slide. So the third rule is working remotely obviously changes the interpersonal dynamics within an organization. And being seen is obviously critical to leadership. And because you're now remote, you're not going to be seen unless you're engaged and you're setting up a Zoom session, etc., or whatever your form of communication is. So it changes the interpersonal communication completely. We're losing that face-to-face, and the non-verbal communication that one typically gets when you're sitting in a room opposite somebody, looking at their body language, etc. As much as you can see people on a screen, there's certain elements of that are lost in the process. But it's important, of course, that the message is clearly understood in the way that you communicate, and you need to find different ways of picking up those clues, those nuances that you may have partly picked up in body language previously. And some of that means more one-on-one communication with individuals as opposed to just doing a very easy team meeting once a week. Next one. So the fourth rule is using technology, and using technology really means that we have so much at our disposal, and a lot of it is evolving very quickly. Bear in mind the fact that it was Zoom that had 10 million users just prior to our lockdown. The last figure I heard, which was a couple of weeks ago, they had 300 million users, which obviously impacts their business considerably. And these are people that are hiring like Amazon left, right, and center to try and fill the gap and the need. It's not something that's going to change in the long term. And it's important, though, that the people that you set up at home have the best possible technology at their fingertips. It's, whether it's Microsoft Teams or using WhatsApp video for different meetings, excuse me. And then the simple things like, good fiber connection, Wi-Fi connectivity, simple things like that, quite frankly, need to be sorted and bedded, right up front. But then there's the continuation of particularly people who are interacting with clients, whether it's administration or salespeople, etc. There needs to be a user-friendly interface and interaction with people outside of the organization in a way that suits people outside of the organization. So bear that in mind up front in terms of the technology that you decide to go with. And then everybody needs to be trained. I mentioned it last week at the last webinar, but Justine is running the sessions here and responsible for the marketing side at BDO. This kind of technology was not something that was used, prior to a few months ago. And having gone on a very in-depth crash course on how to use Microsoft Teams has become something that just makes it so user-friendly and such a pleasure to deal with. So remember that going forward. Next one. So the fifth rule is that leading successfully requires the achieving of goals of many, many different types. And I've really broken them down into three different sections. The one is the organizational outcomes. Does everybody understand clearly where the business is going and where it needs to get to? Are those goals and that vision absolutely clear in everybody's mind? And then, of course, there are the team outcomes. And the team is where people need to be working together on various different projects, that they know exactly how their role fits into it. And it's all the more complex now because people are working remotely. So having various standard operating procedures, SOPs, or methods of working, or very distinct planning procedures is more critical than ever before. It's not a matter of just simply passing the buck. And then naturally there's the individual outcomes and measured through their KPIs. So if you don't have proper job descriptions for your staff by now with objective KPIs that are measurable KPIs, then you're going to struggle to be sure that people are actually productive and working efficiently when they're remote. But if you've got proper KPIs, the KPIs are measurable, you can use those KPIs and they must be used as a form of regular interaction and motivation and appraisal throughout the year. And then, of course, if disciplinary action, etc., is required, there is a very objective measure that can be brought into play. Obviously, that's the last resort. So make sure that people have those and that they are relevant and that they are measurable. They're not vague. People understand exactly what is required of them. The other thing to mention is that people need to understand what a good communication means to them. So it's all very well for you to be the leader and good at communicating virtually, but your staff need to understand, based on their role, whether they're interacting with one another or whether they're interacting externally with suppliers or with customers on the other hand. What does that actually mean? How must they operate? And those sorts of procedures need to be put in place. Go to the next one. So the sixth one is the focus on achieving goals and not purely setting them. It's all very well to want to get to the top of the mountain, but if you haven't decided on what route you're going to take and whether you're going to go in a bus or whether you're going to go in an ox wagon or whether you're going to go in a couple of cars in convoy, and then once you start climbing, who's going first and how's the process going to work, it's going to be messy. You're just not going to get there. And it goes without saying that you need SMART goals. And if you don't have SMART goals, the biggest issue with SMART goals, of course, is the measurability now that you've got people sitting at home, because how else can you hold them accountable and know, based on that original question in one of the earlier slides, is how do I know whether my people are working? Well, you'll know whether they're working because you'll be able to measure that performance. Some roles are more difficult to measure, and there's no doubt that is the truth. But you've got to try and find ways around that, that are practical. So the elements really that are important here is, what is the quantity of work, what is the time factor that's involved, and what is the quality that needs to be measured in an objective way, not a subjective way. And setting the measures in bite-sized chunks, the whole adage, which I don't particularly like, but I hadn't heard of a better one to describe it, is how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. And it's really true. If you want to climb that mountain, you've got to take one step at a time. And the more sustainable each step is as you step up, the more the business will actually get to the top and be able to stay there. Move on to the next one. So the seventh one comes down to coaching your team. And coaching is an area that for a lot of people is something that they really struggle with. As a business coach, I've become really aware of the fact that people in leadership roles really struggle with this aspect, and it's not easy. As easy as it sometimes appears, it's very difficult to be a listener sometimes when you're used to being the person who barks the commands or just has all the right things to say. And there are two reasons, obviously, that coaching is now more complicated and stressful, is that every interaction now needs to be more conscious and intentional. It's you don't have that opportunity to just pop in or down the passage to go and chat to somebody. And communicating through technology obviously also has its barriers and that don't exist if you're actually talking to somebody face to face, through a doorway. Two-way conversation is, make sure that you're not doing most of the talking, that you're actually doing more of the listening. And this is an opportunity to ask more questions, particularly starting the dialogue with questions and getting feedback and input. And right throughout the process, rather than giving people constantly the answers. And this is part of a development process as well. And so, the old adage of give a man a fish and he'll feed for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll feed for a lifetime. And that's part of this development process, giving people that opportunity to make decisions and to challenge the status quo in a constructive way. And then, of course, always follow up the coaching process in one way or another, just to make sure that the message is clear, that people understand, whether it's sending an email afterwards just to say this is what we agreed that we're going to do, or a WhatsApp or something else that just makes it absolutely clear, that just reinforces whatever the message is that you've put forward. Next slide. The eighth rule is communicate in ways that work best for others rather than for yourself. And this is something that a lot of people battle with in day-to-day life, let alone in leadership types of roles. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a DISC profile sort of summary, if you like, DISC, and those are different leadership styles through a DISC profiling process that we use through Assessments 24 globally. And it's a fantastic tool to use in that it helps you not only understand your own personal leadership style and your shortcomings and your strengths and certain things that you need to work on personally in order to develop those, but it also helps you identify how to interact with a person who's a very different, has a very different style to you, or somebody, quite frankly, who has exactly the same style. Where you can end up with conflict situations or, just lack of productivity as a result of just not getting the message through in a motivational way. And it's really something that's worth embarking on if you want to do this professionally, right throughout the organization, and teaching people how to use these tools accordingly. So using that type of profiling can help you certainly in making people way more motivated than they would have been otherwise. But there's also the simplicity of asking people when you employ them, or in this new type of environment, is how they would like to work with you, and get their feedback. Some people would say, listen, just leave me to my own devices for a bit, and then I'll come back to you with the finished goods. Other people will say, I'd really like it if we could chat on a day-to-day basis, just so I can check where I'm going, if I'm on track, or whatever the case is. And people have very different ways of operating like that. And bear that in mind, that not everybody has the same way of operating as you do. Next slide. Then the ninth rule is leading successfully requires an understanding of what people are thinking, not just what they're doing. And leaders need to be seen and to see, and there's a very different aspect to both. Seeing is how you gather the information in order to assess what's going on in the organization. Being seen is how others get the information about how to behave themselves, and how you are as a leader, and the kind of respect that they have for you. The adage of do what I do rather than do what I say is very true in life in general. Whether we parents of children at home, and we tell them how to behave, and we tell them when and what not to drink, etc., and then we have a very different behavior ourselves. It's the behavior they're going to follow, and not the instruction. So be very aware of the fact that you're creating these impressions, even as a remote, and even more so because it's remote, than you would otherwise in the workplace. And then the important thing is to remain visible. And so there is a need to be fairly frequently involved from a meeting perspective, a virtual meeting perspective, but don't overdo it as well. There's this tendency of management very often to feel that they need to look like they're doing something, or they need to make sure that the people are busy at work, and therefore we're going to have a meeting every single day. That may or may not be necessary depending on your kind of business, but don't make it necessary now if it wasn't necessary before, and possibly is a good opportunity to actually reduce the number of meetings that you have. Just make them really quality instead of quantity. Next one. So building trust is obviously a very critical aspect of developing a team, and it really doesn't just happen by default or by accident. It's a lot harder to actually develop a remote trust through this virtual space. It's harder to build it, and it's much easier to break it. And there are three components that are necessary in order to create high levels of trust in the organization. And the one I mentioned already is that common purpose, making sure that everybody knows exactly where they're heading and there's absolute clarity on that front. But then, of course, it's the competence. And I said that you should never employ people, quite frankly, and I say this often, don't ever employ somebody who doesn't have the potential to move at least 1 or 2 levels above the role that you're filling, that you're getting them to fill in the short term. And that doesn't mean they have to be ambitious. It could mean that they are people who potentially just can take on more responsibility in their current role, but don't employ people just to fill a hole. Then you're going to end up having to change them down the line, or you're going to end up with frustrations. And then the third component that's necessary for trust is motives. People that are willing to go the extra mile, and part of that motive is developed through their own motivation, or motivation through your leadership style. And the more aligned those three aspects are, common purpose, competence, and motives, the greater the trust will be in the organization, and the greater the success of the organization. Let's move on to the next one. So the 11th rule is examine your beliefs and your self-talk. I'll go through this really quickly, but it's quite interesting how a lot of self-belief of business owners and business executives is very, very much the hurdle that they need to overcome, rather than necessarily their team. So understand how it is that you lead, and what your shortcomings are, and where the challenges are, and where there's a need for you to develop yourself. But it's important that you have a positive self-image, and a lot of that also comes into play in terms of who we interact with socially, outside of the business environment. The kind of media that you focused on, whether it's social media, etc., that ultimately can lead to a particular way of behaving, and a negative. I'm picking up a lot of negative spirals throughout the media of people who, for one reason or another, are just using blame and denial and excuses, quite frankly, instead of actually taking ownership and taking responsibility. And yes, there are huge challenges that we all face in one form or another, some way more than others. But keeping that positive self-image and positivity is the only way that you're going to get a team to feel that positivity and that energy. And there's simple things that you need to just be careful of when you're sort of talking to yourself in your own mind. Don't sort of quietly say to yourself, geez, I'm an idiot and I can't do this, and what if I'm a bit of a fraud? What if I'm exposed? Just get some of that positive self-belief into your own mind. And there are ways to address that self-belief, and that is, firstly, check of your assumptions. Accept positive feedback. Make sure that you get people to give you feedback. Don't take it as being, take it personally. Take it as constructive feedback, and get help from others. There's a lot of help out there. It's a lonely environment being a business owner, or a CEO, or an MD of a business, and really there are people out there who understand that and work with people in those environments. And some of them can just be people in other businesses that you can actually tap into and share some of your frustrations. Let's move on to the next one. That was quick. So the 12th one is accept that you can't do it all. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges that I come across with entrepreneurs in particular, and small and medium-sized businesses. And I've coached some, well up to well into the billions of rands of turnover that still have owners who believe that they can do it all, or that they have to do it all. So the important thing here is finding the balance between being responsible to your organization and taking care of yourself. And I mentioned that right up front about my own personal sense of understanding and need for balance in my life, in realizing that one of the biggest challenges for entrepreneurs is actually burnout. And it's one of the greatest reasons for failure amongst small and medium-sized businesses in the world. And that's because people are focusing on too many things, and they're trying to juggle too many balls at once. They're not sleeping properly, etc. So it's important now to start looking at your organization's process and the workflow, and to see exactly where there are elements that you can identify, where there are people within your team, either currently or people that you can develop and coach in order to take on some of those activities and responsibilities. And then you need to delegate effectively and successfully. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about delegation now, so we can move on to the next slide. So the gentle art of delegation, and gentle art is absolutely key. So why do we delegate? Well, firstly, you need to create more time for yourself. You need to be able to work on your business, not purely in your business. And working on your business means thinking about things strategically, thinking about the longer term opportunities and challenges that you have to face, not just looking at the day-to-day operation. If you just focused on day-to-day operation, your business will evolve organically, if you're lucky, and more often than not, it'll just lose direction. So if you don't have somebody that's focused on the strategic elements of the business, at least for a good portion of the week, good portion of the year, then quite honestly, the business is not going to go anywhere. And that person, more often than not, needs to be the owner or the CEO. And so it's important, but it's also important to have personal time. It's important to have time with your family. You're not there to work because it's your life. Some people do, I know, but quite honestly, you need to have a social life. If you've got a family, you need to be able to have quality time with the family and be present, not sitting on your computer, busy answering emails or trying to deal with an issue. So the other is give yourself the opportunity to do more and therefore achieve more. So you're not stuck in doing day-to-day routine tasks that, quite frankly, somebody else could easily be doing. It enables you to grow the business more effectively, improve productivity generally throughout the organization, because you now got your eyes open and you're more aware of what's happening around you. It also allows you to spend time coaching and developing your staff, developing them to the next level so they can take on more and more responsibility, which is going to be absolutely necessary if your business is going to grow. You cannot do it all yourself, and don't be a fool to think you can. And then, teach your staff to accept more responsibility and accountability, and thereby obviously becoming far more valuable to you and to the growth of the business in the long term. Next slide. Some are quick changes and some are slow. So the technologies, the challenges of technology, of course. But Rule 14 is ensuring your leadership development prepares long-distance leaders. And here I'm really talking about the process of delegation is to encourage more of your team to become leaders of the future if they're not leaders already in your organization. And you need to have clearly defined set of policies so that they can refer to them and they know exactly where they stand, but also stand behind their decisions and so on. But give them the skills and the training that's required in order to do the task. Otherwise, you're just abdicating and not delegating. Give them the responsibility. So, if you are in fact giving them that task to do, let them do the task. As long as they have the skills and training behind them, that they've got the authority to do it. That comes with the measures in terms of accountability as well. Give them a set time frame so they've got some guidance as to exactly when this thing needs to be completed by, and what the outcome is that you're actually expecting, in absolute clarity, so that there's no ambiguity in the system. And then it's important that you give them feedback as part of the coaching process to help them, to develop themselves and improve that future leadership role that you want them to develop into. Next slide. And then Rule 15 is really the last rule, and that's remember rule number 1. And that is think about leadership first and location second. And that is just to reiterate the fact that leadership is leadership. It doesn't change. What needs to change is purely adapting the leadership to the virtual environment, which is now what we have to face. It's really important to reiterate the fact that more than ever before, I honestly believe that it's entrepreneurs and business owners who are going to be so much more critical in the future leadership within the larger community and the country as a whole, as opposed to relying on government and waiting for other people to do things. Big corporates are downsizing. The opportunity for growth and GDP growth is going to come from small and medium-sized businesses. And that means getting our heads into the right space as business owners of those types of businesses. To enable the growth, we need to be able to develop teams, delegate those teams responsibly, and thereby allow people to help leverage our business to greater and greater heights. And finally, I'd just like to leave you with a point of stop managing if you're managing your teams now, and start leading them. And leading means leading from the front. Next slide. So just to finish up, I just wanted to give you a couple of things to ponder and a couple of challenges just to take away. And the one is to just list, after today's session, 5 ideas that you feel that you need to take on today that's going to improve your leadership style, your leadership behavior, and your team's performance. So just do 5 things, 5 ideas today that you can take action on. And then start to focus on your longer term development of leadership, both in terms of your own leadership, but also in terms of your team, in a more structured way. And actually start to write things down rather than just have these things swimming about in your head. Very often when we get them out of our head and onto paper, it takes the stress away, so we don't lie awake at night thinking about them all the time. And then finally, I just wanted to just extend, which is part of the series, this webinar series, a complimentary 1-hour session, and particularly focused on leadership and team coaching. Just for anybody who may be listening and may be interested, whether you want a sounding board, somebody just to talk you through, or to bounce some ideas around, or you've got particular challenges in terms of leadership and team, that's an opportunity open to you, the fact that you're on the webinar today. And so take advantage of the opportunity if you feel that you would like to. And with that, I'll hand back to Justine for any questions.
We have no questions at this time.
Okay, well, it's a good thing, but don't be afraid. But I know that there are obviously a lot of questions that people do have very often around these areas that are quite personal and not necessarily something they want to share on a platform with hundreds of people listening in. So again, the extension, if you'd go to the next slide, Justine, just to feel free to contact, and if you'd like to bounce off anything or ask any questions directly, please feel free to do so. Contact details on the slide now. And be the leader, not the boss. And I wish you the best of luck, and let's try and get this country going forward by taking action as leaders individually, and our small part that we play in really taking this country to the next level. And thank you very much for attending today.
Craig, we have a question from Anonymous. How to handle a leader who is obsessed with micromanaging?
Yeah, that's the old adage of managing upwards, and it's often very difficult because there are people with that kind of mindset, fortunately, that they've developed over many years. Part of that is exactly that, is managing it upwards and doing it in a sensible and sensitive way so that you're not going to offend them, but possibly even showing them, giving them a copy of this presentation and just not saying, I think you ought to read this because you're a micromanager, but you might find this really interesting. I thought it was really interesting today, or whatever the case is, sort of subtly bring the subject forward. But it's important that you do, though, because ultimately, if things like that are left, they can just fester into negativity, but they can also become barriers to the growth of the organization. Some of it may be that you need to step up and take and say, I'd like to be given the opportunity. Can you give me the opportunity to take this and run with it? And I'll come, to you and check, as we go from time to time, but let me take responsibility for it. And I'm going to, hold myself accountable, and you can hold me accountable. So it's important that a leader understands that. Micromanagement, unfortunately, is such a destructive thing, and it's something, unfortunately, that was evolved over many years. If you think back to the slave days of building pyramids, there was a guy standing there with a whip, and that kind of behavior now has been realized to be counterproductive. There are times where one needs to be absolutely stern and take charge and make the calls, and that's part of the role of a leader, not just to sit back and wait for things to happen. But the stronger your team becomes and the more capable and able they are to take on responsibilities, the more you can free yourself of certain frustrations and challenges and start to focus more on things that you could be doing. So that would be my encouragement, to try and encourage them of your willingness and desire to do that. I don't know if there are any more, Justine.
We have no more questions, Craig.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all being a part of this, and there's more in the series, but I'll hand over now to Justine.
Over to Anthony.
Right, being that there are no more questions, it just remains for me to thank all of you who joined us. And just to remind you that today's webinar is the second in a series of 5. And I'd like to invite you to join us every Wednesday for the next 3 weeks at 12 o'clock. Some of the really good and exciting topics we've got are selling skills in the new world, particularly post-COVID-19. Simple strategic planning and strategic implementation, and then finally the gentle art of delegation. So I wish you the best for the rest of the week and the weekend ahead. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again.